Well, hi, everyone. I think my fellow panelists are going to be turning on their cameras in just a moment. Hi, Dora.
Hello.
Well, welcome, everybody. I'm so glad that we're ready to get started. Good afternoon. I'm Dana Textoris, CEO of Grants Plus, and I'm going to introduce my co-panelists in just a moment. First, I want to welcome all of you. We have a wonderful group of leaders gathered here today from so many of the organizations that we at Grants Plus have been able to work with over many years. So welcome to you. Some of you, we have worked together on government grant applications to pursue federal and state grants. Some of you, we have been your full service team to help you move your foundation grants program forward. So it's good to see you here too. You can also know that many of your team, your Grants Plus team members are joining us today. So we are all learning together. I would also, and let me just get my bearings here with switching our slide. I'd also like to welcome those who represent organizations we have not worked with before. There are some new friends joining us, and so we welcome you too. I will give you an opportunity then, since you are not familiar with us, to learn a little bit about Grants Plus. We are a team of 35 grants professionals stretching across Ohio and also around the country. And we work directly with nonprofits to help them be more successful at pursuing grants, both public grants and private grants. And across the work that we do, we, of course, acknowledge that grant writing is a very important part of that, but it isn't all of it. And we center strategy, having a holistic grant-seeking strategy, as well as centering relationships, the relationships that we have with our clients, and also supporting the relationships that our clients have with their funders. And that is why I really value the partnership that we have with Capital Partners. Because just like Grants Plus, while we center relationships in grant seeking, Capital Partners centers relationships in the pursuit of other kinds of government funding, earmarks, and other allocations. And so we have this commonality in our philosophy and approach that has enabled us to work very well together with some clients that we share in common. And that's given us the opportunity to get to know Dora and Rebecca, who you are meeting here today, and to have such deep respect and appreciation for their integrity and all the great outcomes that they achieve with their clients. So Dora and Rebecca, would you introduce yourselves?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Dora Preuss. I am a partner with Capital Partners. We are an advocacy and public relations firm. We have offices in Cleveland and Columbus. And just personally, I've been with the firm since 2016, kind of a variety of background experiences. I like to say I've both been lobbied and been a lobbyist in my past. I've worked for a United States Senator, a major Chamber of Commerce, the Ohio House of Representatives, and a university in Cleveland, just to name a few. So happy to be here today and partnering with Grants Plus, and I'll let my colleague Becca introduce herself as well.
Hi, everyone. Looking forward to spending some time with you today to talk about the capital budget process. My name is Rebecca Simon. I am a partner at Capital Partners also. I've been with the firm for about 8 years. I've been lobbying for a little over a decade. Prior to that, I worked in the state legislature for members in both the House and the Senate. The members that I worked for were on leadership teams in their respective chambers. And so I've been fortunate enough to also see this process from the outside as well as inside. So looking forward to sharing some information.
Great. Well, thank you, Dora and Becca. And I'm sure everyone here hearing about their background can understand why it's so valuable to have them to talk about today's topic. So what are we here to talk about? We are here to talk about the Ohio State budget allocation process. And why we are talking about this is because we have clients with varying experience pursuing Ohio budget allocations. And in fact, we have supported some of our clients through the Ohio operating budget process in particular. But what I've really come to appreciate from my conversations with Dora and Becca is just how different the capital budget process is. It is highly nuanced, it is complex. It is not a process that you want to feel your way through. And so we wanted to create this space. I know some of you have been talking with your Grants Plus teams about your own interest and potential to explore whether you're going to pursue this funding. And because it is complex, because there's so much to share, we wanted to create this room for you to be able to go a little bit deeper, to learn more from Dora and Becca, so that you can be very discerning in your choices about whether to go for this. We appreciate that time is limited. You can only pursue so much. And so this is not something to be entered into lightly. So what we have prepared to talk with you through today is, what is this funding? How does this process work? What are the eligibility details that will guide you in even thinking about whether your project will be competitive? What is the timeline and the steps to take to pursue funding? Because the clock starts now. And then also to know that we are giving a lot of information in today's webinar. And so there's a lot to absorb. And I think what will really make these details come alive is to hear from you. What are the questions that you have? What are you grappling with at your organization in thinking about this? Your questions will probably help someone else. So you'll note that you have a Q&A function in the Zoom room, and I invite you to put your questions in at any time. We are probably not going to stop for questions as we move through because we want to make sure we get to everything, but we will be keeping time at the end. So don't be shy, drop your questions, and also know that you are muted. So you're safe. No one's going to be disrupted. So with that, I'm going to ask Dora to take us into the content.
Great. Thanks, Dana. So we thought we would start today's discussion by saying what our overall goal is here. As Dana mentioned, it's really to provide a realistic viewpoint of the capital budget process. We also know and appreciate that many of you on the call have state representation of your own, which is great. This process is one that really requires a team approach. So that was great to see as well. Finally, just a little disclaimer, the information on these slides is not an exhaustive list. We provide a lot of examples, but the word nuance is probably going to be used a lot here today because this process is just nuanced. There are a lot of various guidelines that can differ per agency. So we'll get into all that and just know if you have questions, we're happy to answer them at the end. So we'll get started. So what is the capital? Yep. Did you have something to say?
Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to reassure people, I did not note, but we will be sharing the recording at the after today's session. So rest assured, do take notes, but you'll have access to this afterwards.
Great. So what is the Ohio capital budget process? So as many of you on this call know, Ohio operates on a biennium, which is a 2-year legislative calendar. Right now, we're kind of mid-biennium. We've been through the operating budget process that has a fiscal year end of June. And so we've already been through that, and the legislative calendar will expire, if you will, next December. The next capital budget process, what we're talking about for here today is spring 2024 is likely when that legislative vehicle will be introduced and wrapped up. It's a tighter timeline than the operating budget process. Usually the whole thing takes a couple of months versus multiple months. Finally, the community project portion of this legislative vehicle is very competitive, as you all know, those of you that have experienced it before, but that is the focus of what our conversation will be today. So next slide. So we thought it would be important to frame this as we were talking, and I just used the word competitive, how competitive this is. We here pulled out 3 of the biggest counties in Ohio just to say what the community project portion is. So you can see they're all right around the same amount, about $20 million each, and that is the competitive process funding amount approximately that is awarded every capital process. Next slide. So we thought we'd get into kind of the reality check, if you will, if this process is best for you. So first, really, the timeline is important. So that means, do you have a project idea? What is the timeline of that project, meaning internally? The word shovel ready gets thrown around a lot in this process. That is a question that legislators like to ask. Is this project shovel ready? Is this project fundraised for already via outside sources? The state loves to be kind of the last dollar in completing a project, not the first. So when I say timeline, that is both kind of internal to you all in your organizations, as well as, kind of externally, does it fit within the capital bill process? So those are all important things to consider. Eligibility of the project is something we will go over in detail. Status of property ownership, for example, and we'll get into the state nexus and public benefit that these projects all have. So if there's anything on this slide that I really want you to focus in on, it's that 4th bullet, state nexus and public benefit. So many of you on this call all are amazing nonprofits, do great work, have incredible missions. You can have a great project, but if it doesn't fit the appropriate state nexus and have a public benefit, it probably won't be eligible from the beginning. So that's just something to consider kind of, from the front end, going through what is eligible, and we'll get into that. Finally, strength of your relationships. So this entails all the other community relationships that might support your project. That's something that we do with our clients, is we encourage other community leaders, other business leaders, perhaps other elected officials, city, county level, to also support and throw in their support for your project. That's something that we have determined that is incredibly helpful in the past. And then as well as obviously your legislative relationships, because this process, you'll be dealing directly with your House and Senate representatives. Next slide, and I will turn things over to Becca. She might be.
I think
We turn to the next slide. Thank you.
Oh, good.
So Dora mentioned this, and again, one of the themes that we're going to talk about is that, this. Can you hear me? Sorry, can you hear me okay?
There you go. You're okay now.
Becca, it is a little bit challenging to hear.
Okay.
All right.
Becca, I think maybe you're okay now.
Okay. Okay, well, I will proceed. Flag me down if you can't hear me. So capital projects are typically funded with state bond dollars, which is different than operating budget projects. And because of that, there are different restrictions on how those funds can be used, which is why that state nexus portion that Dora mentioned is so important. So the funds have to be used within the purposes outlined within both the Ohio Constitution as well as in state law. And those metrics can be different depending on which bond program your project is funded under. The projects, because they are using bond funds, are typically funded over a 10 to 20 year period. Can we go to the next slide? So when we say nexus, what we really mean is some type of tie to the work of the state agency that the funds will flow through. Not every state agency is a bondable agency. And so we have guidance at the end of this program that you can click on that goes into more of the nuts and bolts behind each of the various agencies' requirements, which are, we wouldn't have time to go through today. But essentially, is there public access for the project that you are considering? Is there some broader state benefit that will come out of your project moving forward? And does the project fit within one of the state agencies that does have the ability to use these bonded funds? We'll have to execute an agreement with that state agency that will need to be in place through the life of the bonded funds. So again, that may mean 10 to 20 years, depending on which state agency the funds are flowing through. Community projects that do receive state funds must use them on capitalized costs. So that might mean the acquisition, construction, reconstruction, rehabilitation, think bricks and mortar type projects. There needs to be a long-term state benefit for your project to be funded. Next slide, please. These are just some examples of types of projects that would be, or types of improvements that would be eligible expenses. So on, a new HVAC system, which, again, if it's just fixing your current HVAC system, that may not actually qualify. But if you're putting in an entire new system that's going to demonstrate a long-term improvement, that would qualify. Significant upgrades to electrical equipment or plumbing, that would qualify. IT and systems upgrades. You'll need to work with your broader team and kind of dig into the nuts and bolts on, is this an off-the-shelf type of software program? Then that probably wouldn't qualify. But if it's a new system, a new system that you'll be working off of long-term, that could qualify. So again, we hate to give you, kind of mushy information, but a lot of times you really do need to, work with your team and work with the state agency that may be your state nexus or your funding partner, and really talk through how this portion of the project supports the longer term or the broader project that will have that long-term public benefit. Next slide, please. These, again, are just examples of ineligible expenses. These are not exhaustive, but generally you cannot use the funds for ongoing operating expenses that will be needed to sustain your programming in the facility. There is actually, that is a question that you'll have to answer is how are those long-term operating costs going to be covered? So you'll have to keep that in mind, but these funds can't be used for that. Funds can't be used to support for-profit entities, or even they can't go towards the benefit of the federal government. Short-term costs like paying for vehicles or leases are not permitted. So, think of kind of, again, the larger scale project that's going to extend for the life of the bond. So 10 to 20 years is really what we're looking at. Next slide, please.
All right.
I'll turn this to Laura.
So we wanted to walk through examples of prior community projects, and this is all public information. We actually, when we share the slides and the recording, there'll be a link to this text that's on the far right there. You can go through county by county, the entire state of Ohio, and see what was funded last cycle, which I think is a really helpful guide in terms of perhaps when you're thinking about a project or what project at your organization, makes the most sense. And then also what dollar amount to ask for. So kind of the classic examples, if you will, of projects that are repeatedly funded in this process are the images that you see, museums, parks, playgrounds. That's kind of like the bread and butter of this bill. A lot of nonprofits are also funded and sometimes repeatedly, cycle after cycle. So I don't know if anyone can see the text there, but we just did a quick snapshot of Cuyahoga County from last cycle. And the Cleveland Zoo was the highest award from the entire county at 1.7, which is a lot when you think about it in terms of that $20 million total pot. They got a lot of money. Kind of the middle median amount hovered around $500,000 or less. The least of which was a community project in the amount of $75,000. So there's a lot in there that are 100, 200, 3, 4, et cetera. So it's just good to help frame your project, because I realize and understand that a lot of capital needs are millions of dollars. And so it's important to just kind of frame that you're probably not going to walk away from this project with $5 million, for example. It's a little bit less than that. Next slide.
Dora, we had one question, and I turned off my video. I hope I'm not slowing us down with my here, but if you can hear me, is affordable housing included in these options?
Typically not, I guess, unless you might be a nonprofit that, does that as part of your work, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. If the person who asked is anonymous, if we didn't answer your question, you can follow up with us later.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll move on to the next slide.
Okay, so this gets into a little bit more of kind of like things to know as you're preparing and deciding whether or not, you want to jump into this process or not. The biggest thing to take away, one of the biggest things to take away from this webinar is, we keep talking about these requirements and criteria. All of these projects are subject to prevailing wage requirements. And so what that means is nothing can be bid out ahead of time. And so sometimes that's where the timeline comes into play again with your internal timeline for the project. Like, for example, if you've already hired out contractors, construction, architects, et cetera, it might not be best to apply for this project for that specific need, because all of these funds come to you on a reimbursement basis, and the state wants to be your partner right from the beginning before any bids go out for any sort of, construction, contracting, et cetera. So we always like to work with our clients and tell them that kind of ahead of time and work with them on deciding what project might be best, because this could kind of skew you either into ineligibility if it's not followed. At best, it just makes it harder. It's just better to kind of know all this up front and think about your project through that lens. Next slide.
Here's where we're going to take a little pause and just remind you, we've had some good questions come through, and we do want to respond to them. So as we are continuing the second half of the presentation, please drop your questions and we'll have a little bit of time at the end to get to them. So we will move on from here.
Great. So just to give everyone a feel for the timeline for this process, it is at this point, I would say, underway. Now is when we are guiding our clients that are going to be applying to really tighten up their project ask and go through and determine what the state nexus will be, putting all of the information together that demonstrates why their project does serve a public benefit, and really making the case for the project, packaging it in such a way that we will present it to legislators in the coming weeks even. One of the things to keep in mind, and this is not a requirement, but it definitely helps, each of the large metropolitan areas in the state typically have a local-led initiative, mainly with their regional chambers of commerce, where there will be a local capital budget priority list put together. I know the 3 Cs do it. I think some of the other larger cities in the state also have this. So now's a good time to reach out to your local chambers to see if they are putting together that type of priority list, and to ask for the application to be considered. Again, if you're not on that list, it does not disqualify you from still applying for these funds through the legislative process. But it oftentimes does help when you're meeting with legislators to be able to tell them, we have secured local support through, the regional chamber in your area. Once you have your ask really buttoned up, you've determined that the project is eligible based on the capital budget guidelines, talked with your local chambers. The balance of the year is really a great time to invite legislators out, talk with them about your projects. If they can't make it out to you, come to Columbus, talk with them there about the request, make sure that they are familiar with the public benefit and the long-term goal of the project. And, your goal is to be in their top 5 or 10 projects that they're supporting. So spend time with them, invite them out. Each office will have their own application. And so you can ask for a copy of that, fill out the information needed, and get that back to their offices so that you're officially in their queue. And then early next year, I'd say probably around late March through May is when we anticipate seeing the legislation introduced. And different from the operating budget, where that bill is introduced in early in the year around February and it's finalized in June. The capital budget, once it's introduced, it is as close to final as you'll see it. There might be some tweaks as it goes through the committee process, maybe changing the state agency that houses the funds for the programs that were selected, but you're not going to see many changes on which organizations are receiving funding from the time that the bill is introduced to the time it passes. And so that's why, today through, I'd say, March of next year is so critically important to get that time with your legislators and really make sure that they are supporting your project. Once, any projects that are selected to be funded past that date of the passage of the bill, you'll work with that state agency to draw down the funds. That process can be lengthy as you are discussing with the various finance teams for those agencies, how you're meeting all of the qualifications for release of those bond funds. So just know that, once you receive the funds, that's great. And then it's still going to take some time to work through that agency's process. Next slide, please. So what's next? We kind of started covering this. Things that you should start to consider. What are your organization's priorities? If you have multiple projects that you're considering asking for funding for, is there one that really serves that public benefit, maybe a little more than the other? Is one of the projects further along? As Dora mentioned, the legislature likes to fund projects that are shovel ready because this is a 2-year process. They want to make sure that the funds they're getting out the door will at least, hopefully, start to support that project prior to the next round of funding in 2 years. Think about your team's bandwidth. You're going to need to put together a lot of significant information. You're going to need to reach out to legislators and find time in your schedules to take them on tours or to be in Columbus for meetings. We keep talking about these eligibility factors, which are critically important. So you're going to have to take the time to look through there and make sure that you meet those requirements. And then again, determine if there is that public benefit that can be easily identified. Next slide, please. And many of you probably already know your state elected officials that serve the territory that you work in. If you don't, now is a good time to look that up. Find your House member and your Senate member that represents both your headquarters, if that's different from where the project will be established, and then you can loop in both. So maybe your base is in one part of the county, but this project's going to largely impact a different area. You kind of double the legislators that you can pull in on that request. Start calling them now. Their schedules are starting to get very busy. They are still in Columbus right now, having committees and some session days. So get on their schedules now. They might ask to schedule you at the first of the year, which, is fine, but you want to start making those calls now and inviting them out to visit. And then the other thing you can start doing now is seek that community support. So if you can get a letter from your mayor, maybe a county commissioner, other nonprofits that you're going to partner with on the project, or that, will see some type of benefit, getting a letter of support to put into your packet of information for each elected official's offices is going to be helpful. Next slide.
So we thought it might be helpful to see an example here, and the centers happens to be a shared client of both of our organizations. So with their permission, I'm going to use them as an example of going through what Becca just explained and explaining how we brought legislators into their facility and kind of what that timeline looked like for them. So the centers has multiple locations, as many of you know, in Cuyahoga County, one of which in Gordon Square is an old building. It needs a lot of renovation. In terms of nexus and public use, that particular location has all of the center's services under one roof. So it hosts a daycare, it hosts a pharmacy, which is the only pharmacy within a block's plural radius of that area in Gordon Square in Cleveland. It hosts workforce preparation services, and that's just a few of the things they do there. They have a behavioral health care, urgent care. So they do a lot of great things. So kind of that public use box is clearly checked from the beginning. And then the state nexus, state agency that we went through is OMAS, mental health and addiction, also kind of just like a clear connection to that agency. So what we needed to do in terms of articulating our project, and really, frankly, you have to just sell it and convince legislators that this project should rise to the top of their lists that they are then advocating for. So we individually had all the members of the Cuyahoga County delegation, House and Senate members, come and tour the facility. It's kind of like a picture says 1,000 words, a tour speaks volumes. Getting people boots on the ground, through your halls and seeing it with their own eye, it makes a huge difference. It's time consuming. Yes. It takes a lot just to schedule and, of your own time as well. But that really is, I think, integral to them understanding, your project and its impact to the community. So in the center's case, we did succeed. It was their first time going through the process. So it was an amount less than we hoped. But what it also does is it kind of gets your foot in the door to then keep advocating. And as I think I say on the next slide, a lot of times this is a multi-year process. And that's also something to consider, that you might either not succeed first time out or kind of get a lesser amount than what you wanted, but that is not a reason to give up or to not keep advocating for your project for the next cycle. That's really important, and we actually see that a lot. So yeah, next slide. So funding success, as I said, is often a multi-year endeavor. And as we stated at the beginning, Ohio kind of toggles every year between operating budget and capital. So after a capital, either success or not, you then have an opportunity to, advocate perhaps for operating funds in that very next year, perhaps for, a similar service operating that your agency provides. And then that just keeps educating legislators in a nice cadence that for the next capital process, they are well familiar with your organization and all the good work that you do. So that speaks to kind of that second bullet, how relationship cultivation happens over a long time. I mean, it's just the reality of it. And these are other bullets we already mentioned a little bit, how the state prefers to fund shovel-ready projects. Your capital stack will be something that will likely be asked for. So, by that, I mean, what other money is either in the door or being actively fundraised for. That is something that is always good to share on your application. And then, most community projects that receive funding tend to be within that $50,000 to $500,000 amount. Next slide. This will come through when we share the slides. So this is a really handy link through the Secretary of State's office. I love it because you can zoom all the way down to the street level and see who your current legislators are. And then you can toggle there at the top between House District, Senate District, and Congressional District. So with our ever-changing maps these days, this is the current snapshot of who is representing you now and who will represent you through the capital bill process. Next slide. Okay, so probably a lot of you have heard about this one-time funding opportunity, $700 million funding opportunity. There's a lot of questions on that slide because we don't have the guidance yet. I think everyone is waiting with bated breath to get those guidelines. We're hearing soon. So we will just really have to see what this process looks like. What we're hearing, and big asterisks on all of these remarks I'm about to say, because this is all just what we're hearing. Nothing is factual yet. But what we're hearing is that this will be perhaps an opportunity for agencies and nonprofits that don't have that direct state nexus to apply for a project. So it's meant to be a little bit more open-ended, maybe fund some projects that, don't so nicely fit into these nexus buckets that we were just talking about. We're hearing that it will likely be bricks and mortar, but you can imagine how competitive it will be because it will probably attract, a lot more organizations than perhaps the traditional capital process will. Next slide.
That is actually the end of our substantive content. And I want to thank you, Becca and Dora, because this has been a lot of information, a lot of really good information and perspective. Some of the questions that we've been getting in the chat are, hey, I'd like that link, and, asking about the resources that we'll be sharing. So we want to make sure you do know that following today, we will send the recording as well as a PDF of this presentation that will make it clickable, along with links to these external resources, which includes the county by county list, as well as the legislative finder. And finally, we're going to move to questions in a moment. And so this can be, please keep the questions coming. But this does not need to be the only opportunity that we lend our help to you in this effort. Dora mentioned that many of you likely are working with government relations firms. And so you may already be moving through this process with them. If you don't have a firm, we want to be available to you because, we do see this is so competitive and so nuanced that it would be a lot of effort. And perhaps effort that won't be as successful as it can be if you are kind of feeling your way through. So whether you are leaning on your current government relations firm or whether we can make a linkage to capital partners, do know that we would like to be helpful to you. And so with that, we have some good time remaining to take any questions. Please, reflect on what we've shared, drop your questions in the question box. We've actually been so on top of things that we've answered a lot of questions along the way. So I'm going to visit some of the questions that were already answered because I'm not sure how publicly the answers are being shared. Carrie, my colleague, had asked a good question to clarify if the state agency, the state nexus, receives dollars to use, or if all of the awarded amount goes to the nonprofit. So Dora, or Becca, you answered this, but is there anything more you'd like to say about that question?
Yeah, and so that does vary depending on who the state agency is that you're partnering with. If you are going through a public institution of higher ed, they do reserve 1.5% of the award that will stay behind with that higher ed institution. And that is to really cover their cost to partner with you. So if you go through an institution of higher ed, you will need to incorporate them in some way into the project. So they will reserve 1.5%, and then projects funded through the Department of Natural Resources, 2% of that award will stay with that state agency. But again, it just varies depending on which agency you go through.
And then sticking with the state agencies, someone had asked about whether it is appropriate to lobby the state agency in this process. And Dory, you said it's good to let them know, but can you say a little bit more about maybe that line of informing them and lobbying them?
Sure. And I can give the center's example again. The centers has already established themselves as a partner of the agency. They work together on a lot of things anyway, so the relationship is already there, but it's more of like a courtesy is how I would frame it. At the end of the day, the funds are coming through their agency, and that agency is the one that is spending the staff time on distributing the funds, working with, the receiving end. And so we always just like to let them know, who's applying and for what, and, that it makes sense and, fits their agency goals as well.
Mm-hmm. Matching funds. So someone asked if matching funds are required, and the answer is that some do. So is there anything more to say about in the case where those cases where matching funds are required? What should organizations be thinking about?
Yeah, so typically the agencies that do have that requirement require between 25% and 50% to be raised through local matching funds. So again, the state doesn't typically want to fund an entire project. And so it's always helpful when you're approaching a state legislator to be prepared to share how the balance of the project will be funded. Again, they want to make sure that the projects are shovel ready and that they will begin in the next couple of years. And so assuring them that there is that additional financial support is going to help your case.
Mm-hmm. And that's very consistent with what we see in grant seeking as well, that funders too want to know that they are not the only entity kind of holding the bag. And so having a diversified funding plan is important in so many spaces. We have a new question about the one-time funding, the $700 million mystery pot.
Mm-hmm.
So are all state legislators already aware of this opportunity, and how are they, how might they be preparing?
Well, yes, they are aware. Everyone's aware. If you spend any time in Columbus, it's kind of like all the talk right now because it's a lot of speculation. So a lot of people are talking about it. So yes, they are aware. And really what we're waiting on is how will that money be spent? What are the criteria around it? So that's what we are waiting to hear from leadership.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That will be very interesting. And I'd say as much as we can, we will be sharing that news when it's finally available. As we've been talking, we talked a bit about the process, and there is, there's such a relationship component. This is so much about maneuvering, and yet there are written components too. So can you say anything more about the written application that legislators will require, and kind of what does that look like? How extensive is that?
Sure. I'll start, and then Becca, if you want to add anything. So yes, each legislator has their own application form. What we've found in the past is typically most of the House members use the same template. So that's nice. There's a lot of cutting and pasting going on, but they do largely use similar questions. And the Senate members in the past, some of them have used their own, but it's all within kind of the same, scope. You'll want to identify your project, and this for the grant writers on the call, this isn't, a 20-page grant proposal or more. It's typically 2 pages. It's like around 10, 12 questions. You answer them with a paragraph. So, it's questions on a lot of the topics that we've hit on, a summary of your project, the impact, the state nexus, the total project amount, and then the percentage or the amount that you are asking for, perhaps sharing your capital stack in there, any other community organizations that also support your project. It's things like that. So, yeah, that's the nice part that, a lot of the members share the same form.
And is that, and Becca, I don't know if you have anything to add on to that too, but and yet that isn't all that isn't the only material that organizations might prepare in terms of photos. And can you talk about whether how extensive is kind of the embellishment that organizations might make to showcase even more of the project in a material form?
Yeah, think of the application as really kind of the nuts and bolts of why your project would qualify for the funds or why it wouldn't. So think of their like budget staff going through those forms to make sure that all the, boxes are checked on, is this an allowable use of funds? We also work with our clients to create a one-pager to provide a high-level overview of the project with all of the pertinent information that they'll need. Think total project cost, your request, and then any renderings that you might have of what your space or your facility might look like post funding, which is a really nice accompaniment for that application. So they're going to get a lot of applications with just kind of the responses to all of their questions, but having something visual that you can leave with them, that you can leave with their staff, we've found is a really helpful way to kind of stay on the top of their list. And that's something that we'll work with our clients to put together.
Great. We have a question going back to the question about matching funds, whether in-kind services would qualify towards that. For example, construction.
Toward the match.
Towards the match.
I would say if this is where you get into the nuance, it's almost case by case. Like I would really just want to make sure that, the agency that you're working with, it's approved through their guidelines. So sorry to answer that with a non-answer, but it's not a blanket answer. Yeah.
Yeah, we do typically include that in the application though. It's always helpful for them to see.
Okay. Yeah. Well, something that you that you said that stuck with me, Dora, is that, we talked about the zoo. We talked about the Cleveland Metro Park Zoo getting such a tremendous allocation previously. And I think that can be intimidating to think for some organizations, if all of this funding is going to be kind of eaten up by the big name institutions, where does that leave the organization that is maybe doesn't have the splashiest or the widest reach? You gave me some perspective that relationships are so key in this, that things happen. Can you talk about one of the maybe smaller projects or surprising projects that was funded?
Sure. So yeah, this is, and when we share the link of the county by county, I think it will be really informative. I know that was in the Q&A as well. You can literally scroll through all 88 counties and see what was funded. And every county kind of has the same situation going on, right? Like Hamilton County is the same way. There's a lot of museums and, places like that get maybe, a little bit of a bigger award, but then there's numerous smaller awards that go to well-deserving nonprofits as well. So it's almost, you have to think of it like the scale of it, right? Like that is something that is taken into consideration, that, if you're a major, institution, you can justify a higher amount because perhaps your overall project is a lot higher
Mhm.
than, a smaller, maybe community nonprofit that, $100,000 would be just as meaningful as the zoo's 1.7, right? So it's kind of, you have to
All
like,
relative.
yeah,
Yeah.
make it all a little bit relative, but you'll see in that link, I think it's a really good indicator of a statewide snapshot of what typically gets funded.
Well, thank you for that
Disclaimer real
perspective.
quick, sorry, Dana. When we send that around, please know that all of the higher education institutions are on that list as well. So, for example, Cuyahoga County, Tri-C, CSU, they're all on there as well. Those aren't community projects. They're not lumped into the 20 million. That's literally their physical needs and projects on that campus. And you'll see some very, very high dollar amounts that are awarded that it's on the list, but it's separate from this community project piece that we're talking about.
Thank you. Thank you. That's good perspective.
Yeah.
And thank you, Dora and Becca. We've got a couple minutes here, so I think we'll wrap up. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your expertise and your guidance. To everyone who has joined today, thank you for your participation and your good questions. We do look forward to following up with you to provide the resources that we've talked about today, and will remain available to answer any questions that we didn't get to discuss today. So with that, everyone take care and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks all.